Good morning and happy Friday. By now you know whether or not the Cubs managed to win the second game in this series. I hope so. If not, I've been fielding lots of unfortunate letters from Cardinals fans and maybe White Sox fans. I'm still dealing with the first loss in the presidential debate, not necessarily in that order, but I'm taking my mind off of all of that, unfortunately, by some pretty harsh news that comes to us in towards the end of Hebrews chapter 10. So the letter to the Hebrews, I've said, is probably a sermon. It's got a Jewish format to it, written to Jews in the 60s, written to Christians who are headed into some additional persecution. This passage that we're going to look at, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 26 and following. Well, let me read it for you. There's promises in the book of Hebrews and there's warnings. Unfortunately, this is a warning. For if we go on sinning willfully after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain terrifying expectation of judgment and the fury of a fire which will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much more severe punishment do you think he will deserve who has trampled underfoot the Son of God and has regarded as unclean the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified and has insulted the Spirit of grace? So this passage feels like something that we've already heard in Hebrews chapter 6. And again, I have said that I'm in the camp that does not think that a Christian can lose their salvation. I'm more Reformed than Wesleyan. I tend to think and understand this as God holding on to me, not me holding on to God. I look at this passage, as do those who come at this through that kind of Reformed grid. I look at this passage as an indictment against those who are walking away from the gospel, who are embracing unbelief. There are some, others, many, who think that this is a warning to Christ followers. Let me say this. This passage is one of 2 passages that Jonathan Edwards, the famous 17th or 18th century pastor in Northampton, Massachusetts, used to based his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, on. Edwards, considered by some to be the most brilliant person ever to live in North America, he was a philosopher as a young man. And there are philosophers that are still mad that he sort of became a pastor and started doing theology more than doing philosophy, because his philosophical writing showed remarkable insight and promise. But he also, and he was president of Princeton, by the way, towards the end of his life, missionary to the Indians, fascinating guy. We'll look at him in one of the inflection points in this history podcast. But Edwards was a guy who preached this famous sermon that was part of the spark for the Great Awakening, which was one of the great revivals in the United States, and actually sort of pre-United States. He was living in the 1700s and in that transition. But Edwards, brilliant guy. Help spark not just a revival, because we don't simply want revival. We want reformation. We don't just want people coming to faith. We want people whose lives are changed, who become serious Christ followers, who grow in the likeness of Jesus, who care about the poor, who become people who are going to share the good news, who are going to be involved in seeing that the churches expand and multiply and plant new churches and other things. So he's a very significant person for many reasons. But on the basis of this passage, he said, look, we need to have our cage rattled. And he preached this sermon. He preached it in his home church in Northampton, and nothing had happened. When he preached it as a guest pastor at another church, it changed the course of the United States, and lots of people who were at church. Okay, so that's the point. Playing church, who were at church but playing church, you can do that, to fall under great conviction. So it is a warning. I think it's a warning to those who don't believe, but I'm just going to let it be a warning to all of us that we should not take God's grace lightly. And if you are a Christ follower, I hope you are, pursue godliness. And if you're been playing church and you haven't made peace with God through Christ, that's the first step. Have a good weekend.